Hello everyone, welcome all. Thank you all for coming. My name is Tarek Al-Aris and I'm the Chair of Middle Eastern Studies. And on behalf of my colleague who could not be with us, Susanna Heschel, Chair of Jewish Studies, we'd like to welcome you to this installment of the Dartmouth Dialogue, focusing especially on the Middle East. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank our sponsors and the people who work to make this event possible. I want to start with the Dean of the Faculty, Elizabeth Smith. Thank you very much for your support for the Dartmouth Dialogue and all your support of what we're doing here. And I want to thank the Dickey Center, Tori Holt, and also thank the Office of the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs as well, and thank also Jennifer Thomas, Judy, Tom, everything you're doing to make these events possible. I'm honored and delighted to have with us today Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, who's a public opinion expert who conducts research and policy analysis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. With over 20 years of experience, she has advised 9 national campaigns in Israel and worked in 15 other countries. She's co-founder of Plus 972 magazine and co-host of the Tel Aviv Review. She's a regular contributor to Haaretz newspaper. She has actually, should read her article today. I was talking to her about it earlier. And she also, her work has appeared in major newspapers around the world, including the New York Times, Newsweek, Time, Foreign Affairs, and so on. She is a political scientist by training. Her PhD is from Tel Aviv University. And she has taught widely both in Israel and abroad. And she has a new book that's just came out, actually, in September. Congratulations. And the title of her book is The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. Dr. Scheindlin will be in conversation with Ezzedine Fishere, my esteemed colleague. So without further ado, I'll give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I have the easy task of asking questions. So I'm going to do this, and I will ask a couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from you, and then keep it going in this way. Just before I start, part of what we do, our approach to the conflict here, is to use it as a moment to improve our understanding of the conflict, as opposed to taking positions on the conflict. And improving our understanding or learning includes dealing with difficult realities that we discover and that are uncomfortable. One of the uncomfortable questions, and I think it was Professor Rockmore who asked that question early in one of those sessions, is whether we actually have the numbers among Israelis and Palestinians that would enable us to reach a peaceful settlement of this conflict. And to answer this question in as scientific as we can method, we turn to the experts. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And
thank you.
I'll start
humbling to be here. Thank you.
With directly, so let's start with the most recent thing. We have this issue about Iran and whether Israeli government should respond to the retaliation or not. And we have also the question of Rafah and whether Israel should go in Rafah or not. And the kind of conventional wisdom is we have a difficult Israeli government, and if they just listen, then we can find a better path. Is it a problem with the Israeli government, or is the Israeli public actually in favor of an operation in Rafah and some form of retaliation against the retaliation?
So first of all, I really do want to thank you and everybody who's helped to bring me here now. It's a privilege. It's also very encouraging from all the conversations I had today to be able to have conversations in such an open and thoughtful way. And I mean that from the students, because really the conversations have been penetrating and the questions have been sensitive and curious. Excuse me, take one more second. In terms of what Israelis feel about the two issues that you raised, I think that they are separate in the Israeli mind. The issue of Israel with Iran is so new for Israelis. The idea that they would be, involved in a direct war with Iran is, first of all, unprecedented. It has not happened in the history of the two countries. And so Israelis, I think, I would not have known what to say if we hadn't been lucky enough to have a new survey from Hebrew University that was conducted just in the 2 days after the war. And I will show the slides in a minute. I just want to point out that that is very separate from how Israelis view what should or shouldn't happen in Rafah and in Gaza in general. And particularly, I think that I think I have an easy answer to your question about, is it the government who is driving this, or is it the Israeli public who's making these decisions? I definitely think the government is making its own decisions. There's certainly an awareness in the government of how the Israeli public breaks down. And believe me, it's mostly a political awareness. The government knows that its ratings have fallen. We're going to get to this maybe later. But the Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, knows that it has the support of only about 1/4 to 1/3 of Israelis. So it's dealing with minority support. 2/3 of the public would like to have elections or would like Mr. Netanyahu to resign. And so, frankly, this is not a government that feels it has a great need to respond to the Israeli public, certainly not in terms of a majority. And as a result, I think we need to see that the Israeli government is making decisions on both of those fronts pretty much in its own interests. Whether we think those are political or legitimate interests is a different story. So those are the first 2 points I would make. In terms of everything to do with Gaza, what we've seen is that the Israeli public has taken a belligerent attitude and tends to believe that Israel needs to do everything in order to destroy Hamas. And if the Israeli government says that Israel needs to go into Rafah to do that, it is safe to assume that that's what the Israeli public supports, even though I don't think I've seen surveys that particularly focus on Rafah. In terms of Iran, again, the reason why Israelis see it as so different is because they are highly aware that this is not the same kind of military interaction, that the confrontation would be, and already has been, much more severe in terms of the potential damage that could be done. Nobody knows where a war with Iran would end and how, who else would get involved. And I think the primary reaction that we saw from Israelis towards what happened after, first the April 1st strike in Damascus that Israel did in order to, kill a top general from the Quds force, and then Iran's response on Saturday evening was, frankly, a huge level of uncertainty, but primarily fear. And now I will illustrate, because the survey data is so recent and pertinent, I think, for this. And so we're going to be asking these questions, so I just gave this a quick title of War, Peace, and Politics, which actually is redundant, right? War, peace, politics. But this is a new reality. So it's something we haven't encountered before. And I know maybe this is a little bit hard to see, but I can tell you if the numbers are too small. Essentially, the question was that if Israel responds militarily, to what extent do you expect a counter-reaction? To what extent do you fear a counter-reaction that Iran, that might happen in the various arenas? And you can see essentially, here I'm going to use the pointer. Here's the moderately and very much. Well, the pointer only sort of helps. But you can basically tell that the number of people who are moderately or very fearful is over 2/3, about 2/3, 68%. So a clear majority of Israelis, I think that's the overriding feeling in Israel right now, is that a further escalation brings Israel into the unknown. And I showed you this slide first. It's a much more extensive survey because I think it goes a long way towards explaining the next slide. The next slide asked very simply, and this appeared first in the survey, at least as presented, should Israel respond, right? Should Israel respond to the Iranian attack from Saturday night? And this survey was conducted literally on Sunday and Monday, and we see that the majority, 52% of all Israeli adults, and this was actually a very big sample, do not think Israel should respond, and only 48% do. Now, that I shouldn't really say only, because what we see is a society divided very evenly in half. Even the 4-point gap is pretty much the margin of error. So you can say Israeli society is completely divided over this.
But isn't this very significant? 48%,
I think it is.
Especially with the first slide. So despite the fear, despite the awareness that the consequences are going to be severe, 48% are still in favor of response.
Absolutely, and that raises another point that goes back to your initial introduction about how important it is to have the numbers. The answer is very important to have the numbers, but that doesn't mean it's a final word. You can interpret them in many ways. And so you could interpret this as despite the fact that over half, about 54% of Israelis define themselves as right-wing, which generally means taking a militant hardline approach to everything to do with conflict, still 52% would prefer not to attack. And yet, despite 2/3 being fearful of what would happen if there was an escalation after this, still you have almost half who would support it. What we don't have here, and this is what was published by Hebrew University, is the breakdown. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that there are numerous subdivisions of Israeli society, but the most important subdivision in terms of really changing the balance of perspectives with relation to either the war in Gaza or on Iran is the division between Jewish and Palestinian Israeli citizens. And all of the surveys have been very consistent that whatever the Israeli Jewish perspectives are, and this is 76% of the population, the Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel show almost the exact opposite. And so if we're looking at the total average here of all Israeli citizens, the weighted average, this is what you see. But if you were looking at just the Jewish population, I would not be surprised if this exact number was reversed. And maybe you would have 52% who were for it. And I mean, without knowing the breakdown, we can't know exactly what the influence was. But judging by very consistent patterns throughout this time, I would imagine support is higher among the Jewish Israeli side, probably very low among Palestinian citizens.
So what does this tell you?
Mm-hmm.
If a majority, say half, let's not use majority, right? Mm-hmm. If half of the population thinks we still should respond, mm-hmm. even though the consequences are going to be severe, mm-hmm. what does this tell us about the general mood in Israel as far as peace and war?
I think that it tells you that the general mood right now is that Israelis feel completely embattled and under existential threat of survival. And for some, I mean, oftentimes this is the first reaction among Israelis, that the only way to address that feeling and that fear or empirical developments that are happening is first of all through military force. That is a long-standing Israeli approach to resolving or addressing any threats in the region. And there have been attempts at diplomacy over the years, but there are also reasons why they failed. So that's one thing. By the way, this division can also be seen as a fairly, accurate or precise, but a division that reflects the Israeli cabinet and even the war cabinet. We know that there are divisions within the Israeli war cabinet about what the response should be, which is why it's taken so long for Israel to decide. We now know, or at least we understand that the cabinet has made a decision that it will respond, maybe is still deciding about the timing and the exact plan. But from everything we can tell, the people in the cabinet who come from military background, particularly the chief of staff, former chief of staff Benny Gantz, and the defense minister Yoav Gallant have been more in favor of a military strike in response. Some sort of strike. What kind, exactly how it's calibrated, maybe we don't know. And Netanyahu, there is speculation that he is a little more cautious about doing a full-out military response because traditionally, before October 7th, he was cautious about starting full-scale wars if he didn't think he could, control them and contain them pretty quickly. Then you have a party like Shas. We forget about the other parties in the Israeli coalition. Shas sort of has observer status on the war cabinet coalition, the war cabinet. And Shas is not as supportive as a full-out strike, at least as far as we can tell, not being in the room ourselves. And so there are divisions. This is why we're seeing there isn't an immediate response. But there are certainly members of the cabinet that would have liked for the response to be immediate, and it might be postponed until after the holiday, as far as we know. And in terms of Rafah, I think that the speculation about this has gone on for months because, Netanyahu clearly believes that there is also a psychological arena to this as well, and has been using the threat of invading Rafah for months now. And every time insists that there are more detailed plans leading to that. But I do think the Israeli public has been convinced that to achieve the goal of incapacitating Hamas, that it is necessary. And sometimes I think, the more a country moves towards a particular policy, at a certain point, it's not just for show.
So let's put this in a kind of a broader context, which is public opinion since October 7th. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the immediate response is usually resorting to force. The war has been going on for 6 months. Are we still in the initial response, or has public opinion shifted inside Israel?
Inside Israel?
Yes.
Okay, but shifted specifically towards the war?
the war, Gaza, not the Iran retaliation.
Yeah. Yes. I think the biggest shifts that I've seen, for one thing, we should be clear that in the earliest phase after October 7th, what we saw is there were no surveys asking, do you support the war or not? Okay, not a single survey that I know of, no survey that I was commissioned to do was asking, do you support this war? Surveys were very active in asking about different aspects of the war and over time. So we don't always have the same exact question being asked. What we usually have are questions being asked about particular aspects of the war reflecting on what's going on at that moment. The biggest change that I've seen is there has been strong support for the war from the beginning in those various aspects, and there continues to be. But Netanyahu has sort of steadfastly refused to define specific goals, how we measure the broad goals that he has outlined from the beginning, which is destroying Hamas's military and governing capacity and bringing the hostages back. Bringing the hostages back is easy. The goal has not been achieved, except for one hostage deal in the beginning that released 105. There's been 120 hostages now released. But the final goal of releasing hostages has not been achieved. The other two goals, there's no way to measure when that has actually been attained. The Israeli government can talk about how many Hamas fighters it's killed, how many tunnels have been destroyed, but Hamas is ultimately still in control of, it's the only actor still representing or controlling parts of Gaza. And even when the IDF pulls out of parts of the north, Hamas has been coming back. Hamas is still the actor who controls the fate of the hostages. It's still there. And there's no further elaboration from the prime minister to explain at what point those goals actually would have been achieved. And therefore, what we see in terms of public opinion is that the rally round the flag effect in the beginning meant that over 90% in a survey by the Institute for National Security Studies said that Israelis expressed, and this is actually Israeli Jews, said they were confident that Israel could achieve the aims of the war. That number has declined over time to somewhere in the low 70% range at this point, which is telling. There's still a rally round the flag effect in place, and Israelis say we will accomplish the aims of the war, but doubts are being raised. And even though the portion of people who did not trust or did not believe that Israel could achieve its aims was very low in the beginning, just a few percentage points, it has crept up incrementally to over 15% at this point. So I think the change is more skepticism about how the leadership is running this war. That is consistent with the decline in support or the lack of support from a majority of the public for this leadership. And I'm happy to talk, if we want to illustrate the attitude specifically towards the war in the beginning on particular questions.
Yes,
I'm happy
please,
to show that
please.
now. Okay. So moving on to the immediate reactions to the war. And shall I bring in Palestinian opinion at this point as well?
Please do.
Okay, because one of the interesting things that I see, you don't even need to ask questions. One of the interesting things is that we often have certain overlapping attitudes. Let's put it that way. Let's start with the Palestinians. This is a survey that has gone around in many circles, has been cited repeatedly. Even Netanyahu has cited it repeatedly. And what it asks is, you can see the wording here, given what happened after October 7th, was Hamas's decision to launch its offensive against Israel on October 7th correct or incorrect? And you have to understand that this is the wording, this is the way Palestinians are talking about it. This wasn't an attempt to give a political commentary on what happened. This is how Palestinians in the region are talking about it. And it also mentioned the consequences, because this survey was done at the end of November by my colleague Khalil Shikaki at the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. And we see that a strong majority, 72%, said it was the correct decision. This is what we mean by a rally round the flag effect. The survey went on to ask if people had seen videos or images of atrocities committed against civilians, and the vast majority, like 90%, said no. Out of those, over 80% didn't believe there had been attacks on civilians, so we can talk about the difference in what people see. But this is a starting point. You can see, by the way, a distinction between Gaza and the West Bank. Note the gap. Okay, over 80% of West Bankers say it was justified. People in Gaza are much less likely to think it's justified, still 57%, but a major difference from the West Bank, presumably because by late November, Gazans were already very much suffering the devastating effects of the war. On the Israeli side...
Could we go back?
Sure.
But then when you say this is rallying around the flag, that's an interpretation.
It is it's a characterization.
Right? It could be, we can use a different characterization for the same numbers.
Yes, you can say, I mean, I think that another characterization is to say they support what happened on October 7th.
Yes, this is entrenched enmity. This is how, even in Gaza, even with the consequences, a majority feels about the type of relationship they should have with Israel.
Yes, that's another interpretation.
Okay.
Another interpretation, however, and this is interpretation that I've heard from Palestinian colleagues who've tried, when I asked them, what do you think this means? Some have said, well, people are more afraid of Hamas now than they were before because they think these attacks they think the war will strengthen Hamas, and therefore they're more afraid to say anything that would sound like it's against Hamas. So that's another interpretation. We're up to 3 at this point.
So now the question is, how do we know which interpretation is more valid? Is there a way we can verify this?
The only way to verify it is to try to supplement what we learn from surveys with other kinds of research, whether it's systematic qualitative research, which I was not able to do, or conversations. So when I saw this data, I got on the phone and spoke to many of my Palestinian colleagues, and I got numerous interpretations, but I think that...
But the people you talk to, there is a bias. The people who would talk to you would probably...
Well, they're not Hamas members,
right.
But they may be Hamas supporters. You don't know.
All right.
Right? I mean, sometimes I know some, if they're friends, I know who they are, but I speak to analysts who are not always my friends.
Okay. Well, that's a good thing.
Right.
Let's move to the
Okay. So, of course, I mean, this is why I sort of qualified that we have numbers, but there's always a range of interpretations. And then, of course, if you were to ask me the trickier question about why people think this, in a longer term sense, there are many interpretations even for the long run. Okay. Is it because there is an inherent, desire to harm and attack Israeli civilians? Is it because of living life under some form of occupation? Is it because of incitement by leaders? Even that, we would have to do much more long-term research to the extent that we can to try to flesh out these numbers, or we would have to depend on other kinds of data. So we do have longitudinal data on Palestinian attitudes towards the conflict and towards Israelis and towards attacks and towards the use of force.
Do we have those here?
Not here, because it's a huge volume of research. I do have some data going back on the Israeli side, but we have much of that historic data on the Israeli side as well, going way back, not always overlapping data. Let me just give you one observation about the long term that we don't have here. But what I find about Palestinian support for the use of force, and what actually, not me, right? This is mostly Khalil Shikaki's work, is that when there is a meaningful peace process that seems to be leading possibly towards an actual peace agreement, we see support for the use of force in any form, whether it's violence against civilians or armed attacks against military targets, declines, and support for diplomacy goes up. And when there are phases where there's no progress towards anything like that and it seems hopeless, support for armed resistance, the use of force in various forms goes up. And what we've seen in recent years is that support has gone up on the Palestinian side for the use of force and the use of armed force military resistance in the absence of anything even remotely like a peace process. And we have some parallel trends in Israel as well. But I'm sticking here to the war. And just to give you a sense of where Israelis are on this, these were surveys that were done. Actually, the first wave began on October 8th, so the very day after, and on October 15th. And this one was a slightly different kind of question, but basically saying, among Israeli Jews, how should the government of Israel respond to the attack? And this was conducted by the same Hebrew University Institute that did the first poll on Iran. They gave different options, and you can see the blue and the red line take up all of the Israeli Jewish public's responses. The blue line is occupy Gaza Strip through an IDF ground operation in all areas of the Strip, or massive air and ground attack, but without occupying the Strip. So some form of a very strong military attack, as opposed to precision air attacks only against the terror infrastructure, which was given as an option, and that's the green part, which only got single digits of support. Again, I would interpret this as somewhere between rally round the flag, but even the term rally round the flag has become a little cliche. What it means is we have to support a military response, and in most countries, I would say, it often is accompanied by very high support for the government. In this case, it's a little bit different. We saw a decline in support for the government, but very high support for the war. So if you're asking about changes over time, which is your first question, I mentioned that the decline in trust on the Israeli side that Israel can achieve its goals is the big change. But what hasn't changed, on both sides, there's been some change, but what we continue to see is essentially very high support for the war. So the same question that on the Palestinian side that was asked about support for the October 7th attacks, or was it the correct or incorrect thing to do? there's been some shifts between Gaza and the West Bank, which I find personally erratic, and I'm not going to, sometimes I think I know enough to know that I don't have an explanation for why support seems to have gone up in Gaza, but the overall total is unchanged. Still over 70%. Even the change there is completely within the margin of error, who say that it was still the correct thing to do. On the Israeli side, even when a Peace Index survey from January, so about 4 months into the war, 3.5 months, 4 months, focused specifically on the question of, has the number of war casualties on the Palestinian side been justified or not justified? What we see is, 87% of Israeli Jews think they're justified, which is another way of kind of a parallel question to October 7th, where civilians were killed, whether Palestinians admitted it or not, in the survey. On the Israeli Jewish side here, they were specifically asked about whether these are justified, and we see, again, overwhelming majority who say it's justified. So in the sense of supporting the war, in the sense of accepting and finding justified, the death and destruction that has resulted from this war, there has not been much of a change. At least, that was in January, which is already a little bit old, so that these are still dynamic situations. But I have to say that support for the war, and support for the background to the war, does seem to remain high.
So one more question, and then we'll open questions for the floor. Does this mean the Biden administration has an Israeli government problem, or does it have an Israel problem?
An Israel or Israel public problem. Because Israel, I would say, includes government and public. And if you're focusing on whether Israel has the U.S. has a problem with the government or the public, I would say the public is not the problem, despite what we're seeing here, right? If America's aim is for Israel to, move towards a ceasefire, avoid going into Rafah, and that is the American government position, the biggest problem is the Israeli government. And the reason is because the public, again, we have some mirror images here, but maybe I'll turn this off for now. The Israeli public is frantically trying to cope with its new reality. The most desperate, urgent issue in Israeli society right now, I think across the board, Jews and Arabs or Palestinian citizens alike, is hostage release. After that, you have over 100,000 who are still displaced, and their networks, and the loss of everything they know in terms of their income and their school frameworks for children, and all sorts of difficulties of living in that situation. So these are the things that are consuming the Israeli public. And I think that the instinctive reaction is just to support the war. But I think that there has not been any attempt on the part of the government to change those minds. And I think any significant shifts in public opinion are possible if they are driven from the top, even though the government has lost a significant amount of support. But that's what's lost. The part of the government that's lost support is the original coalition. Maybe I should show that briefly as well, because I think it will illustrate something. I'm going to skip through some of the others to go to this, okay? These are the coalition parties of the original Israeli government before the war. They had 64 seats. This is counted in parliamentary seats out of 120. The government has dropped to 45 seats for the original parties, which was Israel's far right wing. They would describe themselves as the same way. This is not me editorializing. Okay, and so despite that, I think that the expanded war coalition, which was immediately created very shortly after the war to include what Israelis see as a very mainstream party, even though it's essentially sort of a right-wing Zionist, but sort of focused, at least makes its considerations based on secular principles as opposed to a kind of theological cosmology of the far-right religious parties. The party run by former Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, Israelis see that as mainstream, and they see it as bringing a professional consideration of these issues because it's run by former military people, 2 former chiefs of staff, actually. And I think that the expanded war coalition has the credibility to tell the Israeli public, we need to change course, whatever that change of course may be. I mean, the Israeli public is not an expert on the dynamics of where Hamas is positioned in Gaza, where it has control, where its strongholds are, what needs to happen.
The Israeli public is going to vote if you have early elections.
Yes, they will.
It sounds like a loop,
You could always say democracy is a loop if it's in terms of democratic elections. And I will say that I qualified the title of my book as Democracy in Israel, not Israeli democracy. But the most democratic part of Israel is the elections. Okay, there are free and fair electoral institutions, and there is always a cycle. Leaders always have to listen to the public and be aware of how strongly they're going against or for public opinion, but they also have to lead. Otherwise, the public doesn't see them as leaders.
Yes, but you're saying if there is a government change and there's a new government with a different orientation, that will affect the public opinion. But if this government leaves or calls for election, then the public is going to decide the composition of the next government.
Yes.
So there is no hypothetical time in between where you implant a government with a different orientation that is going to affect the public. It's
well, no, I meant particularly the current government and the expanded war cabinet, but even before it collapses, because if you think it's collapsing tomorrow, think again. The Israeli government is not planning on collapsing tomorrow.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, right now the original coalition was 64 seats, a majority of the 120. With the additional expanded war coalition, it became 76 seats. Then it lost 4 because one party broke away. So now it's, 72 seats. That's okay. It still has a very firm majority. And even though there's all sorts of small potential coalition crises, the very fact that we're having a potential escalation with Iran means there's not going to be any talk of breaking apart even the expanded coalition. Okay, it would need to lose its majority altogether in order for elections to be called. And even then, it's not for sure. You can have a minority coalition as well. So I don't think we're going into elections quite so soon. But as long as the party of the former Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz, is still part of the coalition, if that government together, Gantz, Eisenkot, the 2 former Chiefs of Staff of the IDF, and the Prime Minister, were to say, we need to decide not to invade Rafah for whatever reason, or we need to change our tactics somewhat, or we need to reach a ceasefire, they would have a very strong influence on the Israeli public, especially if they had the magic key of hostage release.
Do we have any measurement of intentions of voting in case there is election?
We have endless measures of intentions of voting. Well, this is one of them, because you can see that, let's see if my pointer's working. This is the average of polls on April 12th, okay, so not too long ago. The original coalition parties of the government before the war only getting 45 seats. And that's not one poll. That's the average of polls in April, but it's also very stable. Pretty much it's the average throughout the entire phase from October, whenever the first polls were conducted, roughly on October 10th. And there have been at least, I would say at this point, 45 polls published, most of them electoral polls, either by media organizations or think tanks. It's rare to see such consistent numbers at a time of such volatility. So the original government, forget about whether it changes tactic and whether it's worried that if it decides not to invade Rafah, whether the public will punish it. Forget about it. It's not winning anyway. And it knows that. Netanyahu knows that his government can't win right now. So, that is certainly one of the considerations, among many considerations he has in terms of what to do, I think in everything with relation to the war. I would not go so far as to say it's the only consideration, only because I cannot prove it. I don't have evidence to prove it, but we've lived with Netanyahu long enough to know that it is clearly something that he is tracking very closely and does not have illusions that if elections were held right this minute, these are the likely results. By the way, there is a range, right? Polls are not 100% consistent, but they are very consistent about the range. The range is 42 to 48 seats for the original coalition. And that means all the opposition parties are getting, between about 75 seats. And now, those parties of the opposition can't just snap their fingers and make a coalition, because they are very, very, diverse in their attitudes. We saw what happened when they tried to make a coalition in 2021. They barely managed to get a coalition together. It was unstable because they have political divisions.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to open the floor for questions. Yes, please. If you can identify yourself, say your name, and then ask a question.
Sorry, what was that?
If you can identify yourself and then ask a question.
So my name is Shema. I'm a 27. I'm a freshman at Dartmouth. So my question is, I know that it is pretty recent since the Iran strikes. So there's not a lot of data there, but I was wondering if you could speak maybe in general to the extent to which it is not formally acknowledged, but there is a general understanding that Israel possesses some form of nuclear arsenal. I'm wondering the extent to which you think this contributes to Israeli citizens' faith in their ability to engage in any type of conflict with Iran or engage in a invasion of Rafah that wouldn't have devastating consequences, et cetera.
I mean, I'm going based on my observations of Israeli society over the years, and I have to say that and over the years and from 3 days ago, basically. And what I see is, I don't think, I mean, again, what the survey showed, and that survey was much longer than the couple of slides I showed here. I don't see that there's great faith that Israel can deal with a full-out confrontation or escalation to full-scale war with Iran right now. There were other questions in that survey about how prepared you think the Israeli military is to deal with a full-scale war with Iran, and the numbers were not good. There were only about 30% who thought Israel was completely prepared. I'm willing to speculate that those 30% are similar to the 30% who support this government, a minority. There was another portion who said maybe it's somewhat prepared. But I don't see, overwhelming levels of confidence, nothing like the support you see for Israel's war in Gaza. And so I honestly think that the great irony of nuclear weapons is that, it's the greatest possible weapon humanity has known, and, primarily because it's never used. And I don't think Israelis I honestly don't hear people factoring that issue in. It hasn't been part of the public discourse. I don't have any intelligence to say that Israel wouldn't use it, but I doubt it. And so I don't think Israelis are really seeing that as part of the equation, certainly not with relation to Gaza, because nuclear weapons can't be a factor with relation to the war in Gaza. I mean, there would be too much damage, it's too small a geographic region.
Are there general numbers on, I guess, public awareness of nuclear weapons in Israel?
I don't have numbers like that, but I think it's generally understood that Israel might possess them. Am I letting you choose?
Yes, please.
Hi, Udi Greenberg from the History Department. Thank you for this. My question is, to what extent the American administration, Biden administration, has any influence on Israeli thoughts, support for the war? To what extent the Israelis' public support for this war is influenced by knowing that the American administration will protect it or shield it from any potential consequences? Or to what extent American support for the Israeli government is enhancing Israeli support for the war, or to what extent this does not factor into the Israeli public's thinking about this topic?
Yeah, I think it does factor in. And I think that, for the most part in the very beginning, certainly for the first number of months, the Israeli public has shown, whenever asked about the issue, has demonstrated overwhelming relief that America has been such a stalwart ally of Israel, and it seemed good in the beginning. And then there was increasing concern in the Israeli public. Again, some of this is really anecdotal, but you can feel it in the commentary in the media and conversations with people, that there's increasing concern that America is beginning to be more critical of Israel's policies, and all of that is very heavily covered in the Israeli media and Israeli conversations. People are aware that that will be a problem for Israel. But I don't think it goes so far as to say that's a reason for Israelis to be highly supportive of the war. In other words, the reason Israelis are supportive of the war is very much an internal conversation. And from the moment October 7th happened, Israelis have been extremely inward-looking. The vast majority of media coverage is about internal affairs, domestic affairs among Israeli citizens. The situation of, telling the stories of October 7th is a big part of the airtime right now. Personal stories of families, witnesses who went through it. That's a big part of what Israelis are thinking about. The situation of the hostages, the situation of the displaced, other issues going on in Israeli society to some extent, crime and normal things. And then, in the additional time left over in news broadcasts or in newspapers, there'll be coverage of what the rest of the world thinks, and of course America is top of the list. But that's still a pretty low position. So I think first and foremost, when Israelis are attacked, they absolutely kind of hunker down and go into a bunker mentality, and it's within that bunker mentality that says that the immediate response is nobody's on our side, nobody can help us. It's up to Israel to defend itself from these attacks, and then okay, who's on our side? Then they start asking who's on their side. So I wouldn't say the American support is a reason why there's such support on the Israeli side for the war, but I do think there is a kind of complacency that Israel can continue to do what it wants. Israel's a sovereign country. Even if America is not fully supportive, Israel can continue doing this. And I don't think Israelis have really internalized that America does possess the kind of tools that could actually constrain Israel if America were to go much further, for example, in conditioning weapons sales, but so far it hasn't happened. So they haven't been able to imagine that scenario.
Simone.
Hello, my name is Monique Cummings. I'm a senior. I had a similar question, but more about the impact of regional actors on the either confidence or wariness of both the Israeli government and the public. And I'm thinking specifically of the recent support that Jordan gave Israel against Iran.
So does Jordan's support make Israelis more emboldened or feel more secure and confident in their ability to fight this war?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that Israelis were tremendously relieved and, frankly, in a way, almost weirdly celebratory. I mean, not that they were dancing in the streets, but there was the sense of relief was mixed with a sense of what a great thing we learned that Jordan is such a wonderful ally that it participated, in this coalition to help repel the attack. I heard the anecdote that I can't get out of my mind is that I heard, there's a kind of lighthearted Israeli show on the radio during the day, so like daytime talk shows about current affairs, but a little bit more bantery. And they said, Jordan really came through for us. This was so wonderful. I think we're going to see a whole generation of babies who are born and they're going to be called Jordan because it covers both genders, and it's fine. So, I think that there is a complete lack of understanding about the position that put Jordan in. Absolutely no awareness that Jordan is under severe pressure from its own public for Israel's war in Gaza, even though that has received a little bit of coverage, that there have been significant protests from the public in Jordan, and that Iran might find Jordan a very good proxy ground for expressing its anger. And Iran already said that any country that helps, that helps to strike Iran or helps attack Iran would be punished by Iran. There are Iranian-backed militias in Iraq with a nice, easy access border to Jordan who have already threatened to try to recruit Jordanians to those militias, and that could destabilize the kingdom. I think that there is a real threat to Jordan, and I think the Jordanian leadership already said, people who think we're, just now a complete permanent ally in this coalition, they're overstating the case and they don't understand. It's like the leadership is trying to walk that back a little bit. So that is being understated in Israel. There is a bit of overconfidence, but that's because Israelis are looking for overconfidence in the situation. And there's also a broad belief that Israel has regained all of the diplomatic credibility that it lost over the first 6 months. Again, I think that's not exactly a nuanced perspective and not entirely accurate. But now Israelis are asking themselves, how can we leverage that renewed credibility and support immediately to help with the situation with Iran, and how can we not squander it so that other countries don't just revert to their pre-Iran position of being critical about the war in Gaza.
So then do you think that Netanyahu and the government would be more wary because they sense the actual consequences and the messiness that can spill out from this?
I think they are certainly aware that they very much needed that international coalition. There are even some reports, again, I can't verify this, that more of the missiles were shot down by American and British and Jordanian defenses than Israelis. I don't know if that's true or not, but it comes from fairly credible sources. So there's a very high awareness in the government, but I'm still a little bit skeptical about what it's going to mean for actions in Gaza.
Go ahead.
Hi, Dan Rockmore, Math Department. I actually have a question about numbers. So you mentioned that I can't remember what was measured, but let's just say I'm assuming it was support for a two-state solution, that people felt like there was making progress, that support for something declined. I mean, you mentioned some measurement declining when it looked like progress was being made. So my question is, was it progress toward a two-state solution? And in that case, what does actually support? I mean, it increased to what? So was it 5%? Was it all of a sudden 50%? And then, and just to follow up so I can hand this off to someone else, I'm also curious about your, how much you believe the measurements of the polling in Gaza and the West Bank. The thing about the measures in Israel, because it's an open democratic society, when people disagree, they just disagree and they don't care. Somebody calls somebody, do you like the government? No, I hate the government. I don't know if a pollster in Gaza calls a random citizen in Gaza, do they actually feel safe in responding that, I'm not happy about this. I wish things were different. So, if there's some way to actually measure the error bars in that sample. So again, two questions. What was actually, when a two-state solution is on the table, like how much support is there in Gaza, and also how believable to you as a pollster are the numbers in those territories?
Both of those questions are a
And
little
maybe this is a good segue to
Yeah.
talk a bit about the longer term.
Yeah, and what's changed.
All right, yes.
Okay, so in terms of what I was referring to about Palestinian attitudes towards the use of force or armed resistance or even attacks against civilians, there's often a question in these surveys that says, which do you think is the best way of advancing the aim of ending occupation? Is it through armed resistance? Is it through diplomacy and negotiations? Or is it through civilian protests, civil protests, that kind of thing? So it's one against the other.
Occupation. I mean,
Yeah, but the question basically is sort of the introductory part is what is the best means of achieving this, and then the four answers in a closed list. So it's one gets higher. There's sort of a direct inverse relationship. So one gets higher, the other one gets lower. Separately, we have lots of questions about a two-state solution and support over time, and I'm happy to show some of that historic data. But it's not. I wouldn't say these are like huge gaps, right? And I can't go through every single year, but let's just say that if you have a list of four means, roughly, by which Palestinians think they could achieve their goals, it's more like which one comes up on top. Right, which one is the top response, and which one is the middle, and which one is in the lower response, that kind of change. And these are sometimes longer-term shifts. In terms of how much to trust Palestinian data, okay, I would call Palestinian society somewhere a sort of a mixture between responding quite openly and freely and critically over time. And how do we know this? Because we see change over time. We see times when support for Hamas is higher or lower. We see gaps between Gaza and the West Bank. And usually, the gaps are not in Hamas's favor in Gaza, where people are more strictly under Hamas's rule. They express much more critical approaches to Hamas. Another example that I can tell you, although I didn't have it in a slide, is that in the survey that was done in late November, there was a question asking, who do you think should rule Gaza after the war? And they gave a few responses, Hamas or the Israeli military or the PA or international forces. And in the West Bank, over 70% chose Hamas. And in Gaza, 37% chose Hamas. And they weren't afraid to say that. And it was one of the biggest gaps between the two societies. That's just one example. And attitudes change, on other issues that are considered very sensitive with relation to, for example, support for the use of force or support for the peace process, which is not always popular. But even if it's not popular, people might say they support it more or less. So on the one level, there is openness, and we have enough tracking data to know when the data makes sense or when it's an anomaly. But I do think you can't ignore the political environment, and I have written about this, trying to explore what public opinion research means in unfree societies. Because you can't really consider it a free society in the same way as Israel is more free certainly in terms of expressing attitudes. And so I think that you have to qualify or try to use that as a counterweight, but I don't think we can measure that counterweight. At least I haven't seen experiments to do that, to try to correct for whatever bias might be in terms of how people express themselves. It's at the level of subconscious, responses in ways that are more likely to conform, for example. But you don't know. You have to have a theory and then try to test that and do much more much more systematic experiments to know that. I do think that one of the things that I've noticed since the war is that, for example, when I saw this erratic change of higher support in Gaza, like significantly higher support in the March survey for saying that Hamas's attack was the correct decision, I don't have an explanation for it. I think there are numerous other erratic changes between the November and the March surveys, particularly in Gaza. And so I say, well, this is both a society that's not free and a society under extreme duress. Displaced, under wartime. Everybody I speak to in Gaza has lost an average of 30 family members. And so, I would expect attitudes to be a little erratic, and that's why I refrain sometimes from interpreting exactly what those shifts are in answer to your question, yeah. And I will show a little bit of the historic data.
Yes.
So we know where we are in terms of looking at, and this is what I skipped over before. Here, this is the one. So basically, if we want to know how people feel about the two-state solution, which is kind of the barometer for where people are on peace. It's not that people necessarily think a two-state solution is the right or feasible solution, but it's a question that we've been testing for many years in this form where we say, do you support or oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state next to Israel, which is known as the two-state solution? That wording goes back to 2010. And you can see that this is a long-term decline. In other words, from 2010 and even for most of that decade, both Israelis and Palestinians still showed a majority who supported the general concept of a two-state solution before they knew all of the details, before we told them what it really means and what the actual compromises are. This was a sort of general mapping question. And what we see is that by the middle of the decade, the Palestinians dipped below the halfway mark, then went back up a little, then a little below. And then you keep going, Israeli support was going down as well over this time, until by the time you get to July 2018, both sides fall below a majority, okay? And it goes down to what looks like slightly higher support among Israelis, okay, almost 40% and just a third among Palestinians. This is the last time we did a joint survey. However, remember that the Israeli population includes the weighted average of the Jewish and the Arab population. Among the Jewish population, support for the two-state solution was 34%. Okay, so exactly within the margin of error, a mirror image of the Palestinian side. And because Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel bring the average up, that's why the Israeli data is somewhat higher throughout that whole time, by the way. And what we've seen on both sides is that, there are too many numbers to go through all of them. Oh, this one seems to have dropped, probably a Mac problem. But I can tell you the data because I know it in my head anyway. Basically, this is a different survey that it appears on the slide somewhere. That shows about that support, in September 2023, just before the attack, this is the Peace Index survey from Tel Aviv University, support among the Jewish population was about 35%, pretty similar to what I told you about December 2022. Within, I think it was their first survey was probably November, support had dropped to 29% among Jewish Israelis, and then by their next survey in January, down to 27%. So an incremental but significant decline over time for the two-state solution for the same exact question that I showed you before. And on the Palestinian side, you basically have a similar dynamic with one major anomaly, okay? So again, between September and December, you saw almost no change, basically about a third. Still, the 2 points are within the margin of error, although interestingly, in an upward direction for reasons that, again, I can't explain. And then very little change actually in the West Bank, really 30, 33, 34. It looks like a small rise, but it's actually within the margin of error. At first, no change in Gaza between September and December, but suddenly in March, a completely unusual response in Gaza, very high support for the two-state solution. This goes back to your question. I won't venture to interpret that jump. I don't know if it's significant yet. It's only one survey. Whenever I see one data point that is a severe anomaly, I always wait for another survey.
Could you go back 2 slides? Or one, yeah. So can we talk a little bit about those numbers?
I can talk a lot about those numbers.
Maybe not a lot, just a bit. What does this tell us about the question we're asking here, the main question?
Yeah.
Just if
do
we're
Israelis
talking
and Palestinians
about
one piece?
a third of the population on both sides in favor. So why are we talking
doing
about?
This? Right.
Yeah.
I think that we have to, first of all, let me explain what I see as the best explanations for this. Because when I said before, that I characterized the Palestinian support as a rally around the flag, you said there are other interpretations. So my analysis of this over time and through all the other data I have in my, in my database in my head and all the surveys we've done, the main explanations for this are twofold. And there may be more, but I think the most important explanations for this decline on both sides is that A, there has been no significant progress, either in negotiations towards reaching a two-state solution, nor on the ground. In fact, the situation on the ground has been moving away in terms of the geopolitical realities in the field. Settlement expansion, greater Israeli control in the West Bank, Gaza increasingly isolated, all of that divides the Palestinian population, weakens the leadership that supports a two-state solution. And on the Israeli side, there have been a series of governments elected that are against it. And so the political reality is that has pushed the idea of two-state solution or reaching it into a completely remote area of people's minds. So it's not part of their reality. It was, and then it declined over time, right?
But this is a decade.
Yes, this is a decade, because those are the process that I just said has been going on for that entire decade. And then there's a second major reason, which is related to the first, and that's a series of wars, right? From late 2008, early 2009 onwards, there have been There were at first 3 different wars with Hamas, or you can call them operations, whatever you prefer, and then a bit of a gap in which there were all sorts of cycles of violence, lone wolf violence, whatever you want to call it, and then another war or escalation or operation in 2021, so that's up to 4, and then there were mini escalations in Gaza in 2022. So every time there is an escalation that feels like a war, it makes people feel, we see the immediate impact is generally a decline, and so that goes on the whole decade.
Let me push back a little bit on this, okay?
Please.
So, there is always a reason somewhere
Yes.
for why people think what they think,
Yes.
right? But if we have life as it's happening in this conflict over a decade, led the support to go down from 70% to 34%, then saying, well, those are, the consequences of things that happened,
Yeah.
doesn't add much, does it?
I think it adds a lot. I'll
It
tell
is,
you
yeah,
what,
because all of these things, bad things happen, then we are here. But the bottom line is we are here. There is not remotely enough support for a two-state solution among Israeli Jews or among Palestinians. That's a fact. Am I right?
You're right that there is minority support. When you say there's not enough support, you imply that you need to have a majority in survey research in order to pass a policy. But if you have if you have legitimate leadership who has either been elected or is considered legitimate, however it got there, unless you formally need to have a referendum in which people vote on a particular policy, the way politics usually works is that you elect a leader and then you entrust them to represent your interests in their policy making.
So we need leadership that you and I call legitimate because we like the two-state solution, that gets elected somehow, and then once they're elected, they were like, sorry, the majority that elected us, we will go with the minority. And that somehow those leaders are going to stay leaders.
No, but that's not even logical because otherwise they wouldn't get elected.
So how would that work?
Right.
Could you walk me through it?
Okay, so
Yes.
what I'm saying is, I'm not saying tomorrow you can have that leadership be elected on the platform of supporting a two-state solution, or they would have to do it and then go against the public. But it would not be the first time in Israeli history that a political leader was elected on the basis of representing a particular and primarily hardline attitude, who then took a different policy.
Could you give us an example?
2 examples.
Yes.
Menachem Begin, who was the head of Likud, who actually, was the firebrand nationalist who had been head of Cherut and then Likud throughout Israel's history, who believed in Greater Israel and believed that Israel should own its, the biblical homeland. Okay, he didn't actually do anything on the Palestinians, but nevertheless, Israel was absolutely committed not to giving up Sinai. If you look at public opinion research, the majority were dead set against it. There are a number of questions and surveys over those relevant years, and they all showed the same thing. Pretty much, there was not a single survey that showed a different trend. It was either we shouldn't give up on the territories conquered in 1967, or we shouldn't withdraw from Sinai. Any way you asked it, Israelis were against it. And then Sadat came to visit the Knesset. The negotiations began and ended with a full peace agreement.
But
and
didn't the public opinion change
it changed
before Begin changed?
After. No, public opinion absolutely did not change beforehand, but after the agreements were signed. They began to be more supportive of negotiations and a peace agreement after Sadat came to the Knesset, because this was an incredible breakthrough move. That's absolutely, it's such a good example that it's become a cliche. Everybody uses this example. The other example is Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon was considered the father of Israeli settlements. He wasn't the only father. The Israeli settlements had many fathers, and maybe a few mothers. But Ariel Sharon was considered a friend of the settlers. He supported them from the beginning. He would help them, tell them where to set up new outposts that would, kind of be a good location for them to do it. And he liked to help with their infrastructure so much that as Minister of Housing, he, helped get roads and infrastructure created to help serve them, and earn the name the bulldozer, also because he liked to get things done and bulldoze his way through stuff. And when he was elected prime minister again, the Israeli settler community was overjoyed. But within about 2 years of being elected prime minister, he was elected prime minister in 2001, and roughly from about 2002-3, let's say, he began advocating, this was in the middle of the Second Intifada, when Israeli attitudes in wartime were very belligerent. And I was seeing the major shifts towards, very hardline attitudes, reversals of support for negotiations and for, anything that we were asking at that time that was supportive of peace, because I was doing this research from 1999 onward. And Ariel Sharon began talking about the need to withdraw settlements from Gaza and to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza. And he talked about it for a year or so, thereby legitimizing it to the point where there was over 60% support by the time the disengagement actually happened, which was in 2005. I think the first time he gave a speech about it was maybe 2003, I should say. But that's a classic example of him being elected on a completely different premise, building support for public opinion by using his considerable authority in Israeli society. Like it or not, Israeli public liked him once he was back in power, even after they were sort of angry at him for Sabra and Shatila, or his role in general in the Lebanon war. And by the time of the disengagement, Israel was able to forcibly remove its own citizens from settlements that the government had backed for all those years, despite bitter protest from not only the settlers themselves, but of course whole communities of supporters in the religious community. Some of the same stuff we've seen in 2023, threatening to not serve in the army or serve in reserve duty or threatening to disobey orders. You had young people who were lying down in the roads and or fighting with soldiers. I mean, there was massive. It was so divisive that Israelis were worried about a civil war. It didn't happen, but one of the reasons it didn't happen is because he had built support among the Israeli public to the point where it was a majority. And that's my final answer to your question when you say there isn't enough support. You're right, there isn't enough to elect a government now on that premise. But we have any number of precedents for how public opinion changes. It changes in response to events. Okay, the events were driving this, and it changes in response to leadership. And so those two things, I think, at this point, are the only possible way to change Israeli and Palestinian minds.
Thank you. Let's see, more questions here before we go.
You have a couple on this side. Oh.
Here, please. Evan?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Evan. I'm a second-year student. I wanted to ask, a lot of the numbers are very convincing and very telling about Israeli Jews, and I'm interested in research that goes to diaspora Jews and if Jews of America or Europe or whatever it might be mirror those of Israeli Jews.
They tend to be similar in one way, and that's in terms of support for Israel and generally, believing in Israel's right to exist and right to defend itself, and believing that there should be community, that Jewish communities should support Israel. But in many other ways, they differ, especially among younger populations. And I would say the biggest contrast is between young Israeli Jews and young American Jews. I think that European Jews are somewhat different from American Jews on this. But the most important contrast is that young people in America, I mean young, 18 to 30, let's say, in general, and including among American Jews, are much more liberal-oriented. They're much more liberal in general. They're much more likely to vote Democrat. They're much more likely to support progressive policies. And they're much more likely to criticize Israel's policies, including among young American Jews. Among young Israeli Jews, the trend is the opposite. Young Israeli Jews are significantly more right-wing in terms of their orientation and self-definition in surveys. It's not me saying that, it's the respondents, consistently, than the general Israeli Jewish population. And there's significant, and they're even more, the biggest contrast there is between young Israeli Jews and 55 and up. So the 18 to 34-year-olds are, about 65% of them self-identify as right-wing, even more, sometimes 68% or even 70% self-identify as right-wing, which means firm right and moderate right combined. We usually give, levels. And among the 55 and up population, that response can be 45 to 55%. That can be the range. So it's a very significant difference. Now, I think that creates a lot of misunderstanding. I mean, or it's the result of very different realities, very different sort of environment, political environments in the different communities. So that's one of the major differences. The other major difference is generally American Jews are much more supportive of a two-state solution or a negotiated political resolution to the conflict than Israeli Jews are at this point.
More questions? Yes, please.
Oh, I was wondering.
Hold on just a second, we'll get you a mic because it's live streamed.
I was wondering, to what extent this issue of a two-state solution, if the division is along more political leaning lines, if for example, the far right makes up the majority of those who do not support it, and the far left the opposite, or if this is not one of those more divisive issues?
It is the defining divisive issue. In fact, if you ask Israelis whether they are left, right, or center, this is what they mean. Or any derivative issue. Support for settlements, support for concessions, support for negotiations, support for dividing Jerusalem, support for right of return, very, very low, for Palestinian refugees, or anything related to the conflict, support for annexation. This is basically what it means to be left, right, or center in Israel. So I think it's easier to explain the reverse. If you look at the people who self-identify as firm right, which is about a quarter of the total population, you will find that 90, let's say 70% of them reject a two-state solution, roughly. If you look at people who define themselves as moderate right, maybe I would say 60% of them reject it, and maybe 20% of them support it, and another, the remainder, 20% are kind of in between or don't know. But there's always, in other words, the scale of how people identify, and among the center, by the way, you generally have over 60% who do support a two-state solution. Among the left, over 70, even 80%, sometimes over 80%, sometimes more than 80%, So what I mean is this actually defines what it is to be left, right, or center, and that no matter how we ask the question about left, right, or center, whether we say firm, moderate, center, moderate left or firm left, people respond on the two-state solution question accordingly. The highest rejection is among the firm left, somewhat lower rejection, and a certain slice of the moderate right. Sorry, I meant right.
Yes.
Yeah, who reject it. Even less among the centrists and almost none among the lefties, and also with gradations among moderate left and firm left. And if we ask the question in a different way and say, where would you rate yourself between 0 and 7 on the right-left scale, you still see the same differences at every gradation of that scale. It's the most sensitive barometer for predicting what people's attitudes will be on issues related to the conflict.
Thank you.
So I was really interested in the narrative of the... Sorry, thank you. The examples of Begin and Sharon, and so Begin is paired with Sadat. But do you have other examples on the Palestinian axis of people who have taken leadership positions, possibly in strong opposition, and then said to themselves, this is my cartoon of it. If two people say that we both must occupy the same piece of land, there's only one way around that. But if two people begin to think that there are multiple ways for multiple people to occupy the same piece of land, then you can start to talk about it. So on the Palestinian side, who also showed a turn?
There is one important Palestinian figure I can think of, and his name is Yasser Arafat. Okay, right? Because for most of Palestinian history before 1988, Fatah stood for a single democratic state in all of historic Palestine. That was basically their premise. Whether you say you believe that they were genuine or not, maybe they didn't really mean a democracy, maybe they didn't really want Jews there, maybe they would not have been nice to them. You can say and never mind, you also have to look at the tactics that the PLO used in those earlier years, which involved terror tactics. So you could say, well, they didn't mean any of it, but that was their formal position. And I think I can say confidently that was the position of the vast majority of Palestinians, whether they were in exile or in the region.
So this is actually a good segue if we can talk about the domestic politics, the last part in Europe. But first we'll take a question, and then we can move to discussing more political landscape.
Sure.
Right.
But I think the point is important because this was the broad Palestinian position. I don't think Palestinians really thought much about a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. I don't think it was on people, it just wasn't something that was part of the Palestinian national movement until 1988. All of a sudden, the PLO realizes that it's being upstaged by those local Palestinians who started their own little uprising while the PLO was sitting in Tunis. And this is my interpretation of the background, but the PLO kind of decided we need to take back some leadership and credibility. And, for various reasons, let's say, in 1988, Yasser Arafat declared that the PLO's aim was to, A, renounce violence. And again, you can say later on, well, that didn't matter because they continued to use violence. But at that time, that was a major shift and not what the Palestinian public knew that they would do. And our aim is to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Jordan, and East Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And so that I know that was a significant, confrontation with Palestinian public opinion, because you have Palestinians who remember that time saying we thought it was a betrayal. We thought that was a betrayal of our claim to our homeland, especially those who were not in the region, who were living in refugee camps. And yet, what you see is that by the time Palestinian survey research, gets going, because at that time it was still sort of spotty until the early 1990s, but support for the idea of a Palestinian state in those areas, or two states as opposed to a one-state solution, was pretty high from the beginning, and there was majority support for the Oslo agreements when they were signed, which began to wane pretty quickly. But that is a classic example, I would say, of that kind of transition.
Hi. You've kind of touched on this a little bit in some of your answers to other questions, but I'm wondering, so regardless of whether or not there's support for a two-state solution, at the end of this conflict, hopefully there's going to have to be a state that is managing Gaza. And it's not exactly clear who that could be, Hamas, international coalition, the IDF, or the Palestinian Authority. What does Israeli public opinion look like on those different options? And is there any sort of consensus about who would be the better option, or what option would be acceptable?
Yeah, there has been data on this. It's been asked in various forms. Listen, the Israeli public, honestly, the regular public is not policymakers. And so they're taking their cues from what they're hearing around them and what the government is saying and how they read the situation. But I think it's flexible. And I think that these are the kinds of things that could still shift. But what we see in general is that absolutely they reject Hamas taking power. They generally don't want the PA taking over either, because they've been told by their leaders for a decade now, and amplified in all of the public discourse and commentary, that the PA is the chief inciter of terror and the chief supporter of anti-Semitism, and no different from Hamas, and Hamas and Fatah are exactly the same thing. And so they don't want, and even the Prime Minister has been saying since the war, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying since the war began, that he won't allow Hamas to take over, and any other actor who does, he has these kind of lists, this kind of stock answer that he gives that makes it clear that he's talking about the PA. So Israelis, by and large, reject the PA as well. And for the most part, if there's somewhat higher support, it's for some sort of international coalition, including Western and Arab states. But it's not like they're enthusiastic about anything, and it's because it's not their job. I mean, I think there's a limit to what we should expect the public to be, to what we should expect the public's role to be in policymaking. They don't have all the information at their disposal. And certainly leaders shouldn't be following the public on very specific things where the public doesn't know the right answer and can't be expected to know the right answer. And this is not to diminish the public, because I think the public is capable of knowing and having grounded opinions on lots of things.
Just remind you that your job is to measure the public opinion trends,
Yes,
right?
It absolutely is.
So you might be kind of undermining your...
No, I mean, I'm a defender. I'm a defender of the public against... I can't tell you how prevalent the attitude is that the public is stupid, the public is irrational, the public is all sorts of things. And as somebody who's, my life is listening to the public, A, I think it is measurable, but I think we need to be careful about how we interpret the measurements. And B, I think the public is sophisticated. But if there's not access to information, and they're dealing with new situations, and, first of all, they can't be expected to have, attitudes that reflect the real situation if they don't know what it is. And secondly, I definitely, I'm also a political advisor. I mean, that's my job too, is to take the public attitudes and fold it into what I see as the right strategy for politicians, or at least part of what I do. And I definitely don't think politicians should be running after the public on every specific decision that needs to be made. Leaders, if they're worthy of the term, need to lead. And the results are clear. Not in every situation, but there are situations where a leader can turn around public attitudes with a lot of hard work.
So let's look at the political landscape in
Did you have a follow-up question, though? I feel like you... Okay.
In our kind of last stretch here, and look at the political landscape on both sides and see where those fantastic leaders might emerge from.
Well, I don't think either the Israeli or the Palestinian public see them as fantastic leaders right now. So like I said, and I think I showed you the slide for the coalition in Israel. I'll go back to it just because we're going to be talking about politics, right? This is the coalition slide. And this just is to illustrate, yet again, how much support the Israeli pre-war coalition has lost. Now, again, this is counted in Knesset seats out of 120 mandates. We call them mandates in the region. So what I think is unusual is that we've seen a rallying of Israeli society for the war, for Israeli society itself. When we say, how do you feel about the resilience of Israeli society or optimism, in the beginning, it all went up. But support for the government immediately went down. And this happened immediately after the war. I can give you some other numbers. I think I mentioned 2/3 want elections to be held either after the war or immediately. Up to 70%, between 2/3 and 70% want Netanyahu to resign. Only 20% say they trust the government in a generic sense. These are abysmal numbers, but it's not like the public sees any great alternative. At first, the Israeli public was showing sort of a spike in support for former Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, the leader of the party that joined the war cabinet. I mean, who wouldn't like it? There was no military professional in the government before that to run this war. And so naturally, the Israeli public thought it was a move of showing political unity and bringing some professionalism, presumably, to the decisions. So at first, his party was doing very well, but now even his party is drifting back down. And so Likud is regaining a little bit, but nobody is an outstanding figure in Israeli society these days, I think. On the Palestinian side, I'll show you also, this is a typical dynamic we see. So if you look at the line for Fatah, look at Fatah, look at where these parties were before the war in September 2023. 22% for Hamas, 26% for Fatah. That's been a pretty standard dynamic, or sometimes it's pretty close, but in the low 30% range at various times, a few years ago. That is not a vote of confidence for the two major parties in Palestinian society. Then you have a whole bunch of third parties and don't know. But I put them together to illustrate that most people congregate there, but I can tell you the much bigger portion of that blue line is the don't know.
Is the don't know.
Yes. And only about 10 to 12% support all of the third parties combined. Then you see the war begins, and right away, this is what happens during every war between Israel and Hamas and Gaza. Hamas goes up to 43%. But in the last survey, it went back down somewhat. It's a U, kind of upside down U. And that does not translate into any greater support for Fatah. It's still abysmal. And if you ask Palestinians, 80% want Mahmoud Abbas to resign, Palestinian president. And when you ask, which candidates they like, or just favorability, they don't really like any of them, except for Marwan Barghouti, who's in jail. And at present, we still have no indication that he's going to get out of jail. And even if he did, maybe this is unpopular opinion or iconoclastic, but if he did get out of jail and suddenly won an election or was, anointed to be a Palestinian leader even without an election, because he has the highest support and symbolic status, but was actually then responsible for what happened, I imagine support would decline pretty fast.
All right, so
both societies are in a sort of leadership crisis.
Yes, and on the Palestinian side, this has been described by Palestinian analysts as a kind of a meltdown, right? So when I go back to the Israeli, and if you have numbers on the religious right, remember before October 7,
Yes.
we had more than a year of protest, and it wasn't about Hamas or the Palestinians, it was about the religious right.
Well, it was about the judicial overhaul. That was the main
So
cause of it.
on the component of the religious right, which is more attached to the land than to peace, how big this is, how important it is in Israeli politics.
Very important, but I like this reversal of land for peace to more attachment to land to peace. Yeah, land more important to peace. Very important. It is critical because, of course, those are key parties in the current Israeli coalition. So just starting with the fact that in November 2022, when elections were held, the two parties that represent this ultra-nationalist, ultra-religious, ultra-messianic kind of illiberal, frankly authoritarian perspective, they were running together. And combined, they won 14 seats out of 120 in parliament. That was, if you look at that in the absolute numbers, they got 10.83% of the vote in Israel. I should mention that the number of Israeli Jews who self-define as national religious is probably about 14%. The range is 13 to 15%, roughly. So what we understand is that most of those votes came from the national religious community, maybe a few of them from the ultra-Orthodox community, but the ultra-Orthodox have their own parties. So I'm setting those aside because they're a separate group. And they together have about 17 seats, the ultra-Orthodox parties. So you have 14 seats that went to the national religious parties, about 17 that went to the ultra-Orthodox, and that's most of the coalition, right? Likud got 32 seats, and there's 64, so there were 34 altogether. Somebody can check my math. There were 32 and 32, right? What's happened, if I focus on the national religious, which is the ones who are the most, kind of the drivers of the settlement movement in the past, and now they are driving the annexationist policies on the ground today. those parties, since the war, actually have been stagnant. And this is the same thing that happened to them for all of 2023. For all of 2023, they were not able to get 14 seats again in surveys. And since October 7th, there have been some surveys showing them getting 14. They've since broke up, so now the surveys have to test them separately. These are two parties. There have been a couple of surveys showing them at 15 seats. But remember, I said there are over 45, by my count, about 45 different surveys. The vast majority of them show the two parties together getting fewer than 14 seats, sometimes as low as 10 or even 9. And it just keeps bouncing up and down between those. So for some reason that I cannot exactly say what it is, but I have theories, naturally, they have not seen a rise or anything like a stable or consistent rise that can be seen as a trend, which defies my original predictions after October 7th. Because what I've seen happen in the past is that Israeli society in an active war, especially when it begins with an attack on the civilians, moves to the right and doesn't stop. But Israelis did not move to the right and didn't stop. They moved to the right from the center. From the center, people moved to the middle right. From the further right, supporters of the original coalition moved to the center right. And they converged on this sort of centrist right-wing party in Israeli eyes. And I think the explanation is that during the year of the judicial overhaul and the protests against the judicial overhaul, even many coalition supporters said, we didn't sign up for this. That's an example of a government not doing a good job convincing the public. In fact, it's remarkable because the government had everything on its side for the judicial overhaul. The right wing and the center and left were completely split over attitudes towards the judiciary. There was growing, support within the right for these kinds of reforms, but the government did it in a way that alienated much of the right and infuriated the center and the left, and so they all converged together. And so I think that there was a significant loss of confidence in the government, including from its own supporters, and people know that program was largely driven by the ultra-nationalist parties, even though it was a Likud minister who actually was doing it. Mm-hmm. And I personally think Likud and the ultra-nationalist parties are almost indistinguishable in their policies. The reasoning behind them may be different, more secular, more theocratic, I should say. But so far we have not seen a rise in support, and I think because the parts of the people who formerly supported the coalition really blame them for what happened both before October 7th and then see them as part of the incompetence of governance that led to October 7th and since then. And the government has not stopped its assault on, democratic norms in Israel, including through legislation since then.
Thank you. In the remaining few minutes we have, last question. So we're saying 2/3 of the public opinion on both sides lost confidence in or do not support two-state solution. The hope would come from a kind of an enlightened leadership, but that leadership is not coming anywhere soon on either side. So is your answer that two-state solution is, for the time being, dead? Or is there any reason why anybody should believe that there is actually a path to a two-state solution? In 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes. Well, when you say something is dead, it can't be for the time being.
Well, in the
you're
Middle
dead,
East,
you're dead.
In the Middle East, it can.
Oh, really?
They come
okay.
back.
That's where things come back to life. So I think that circumstances can change, not in the immediate future. So when you're saying the time being is the most important part of it, I don't think it's possible in the next day, in the next year, probably not in the next 5 years. But I do think that the two sides could set themselves on a course leading there eventually, and if they were probably forced to do that or pressured to do that. I don't think it will come from their own initiative or from their people, right? The people aren't going to drive it, and the current leadership isn't going to drive it. I think only through what I consider to be a perfect storm of, at this point, multilateral, massive international intervention, and probably other incentive and pressure measures to push the sides there. I think then they could set themselves on a course and actually set up the steps that would be needed in order to advance that. Institution building, eventually holding elections of some sort for Palestinian leadership, Israel coming to terms with the fact that it has to work out a map and a plan for how to do it. Those are steps that could be taken. Some of them, some of the steps to get there could be taken sooner rather than later. And some of them involve, how the reconstruction of Gaza takes place, for example, economic reintegration, reintegrating Gaza into the West Bank. All of these things are steps that could be part of a pathway to get there in the future if the two sides, I think, would be pushed to do it. I don't think they would do it on their own. Having said that, I also think that if we look at the realities of what's happening on the ground, public attitudes, and what is possible and what is desirable for the relationship between those two states, I don't think the idea of a hard partition is feasible anymore. I also don't think it's desirable anymore because I think that in practice, the two societies are extremely interdependent on one another. Even if they have separate self-determination in separate geographical regions, they will be interdependent in terms of, economically. They will be interdependent because there are and will be minorities of one side living on the other. It's impossible to extract that. And they are interdependent in terms of resources, climate, environment, epidemiology. They will have to, and they are interdependent for their security. I mean, what more do we need to prove that? And so I think that if there is to be any kind of solution based on two states, it will be two states with built-in institutional cooperation, eventually freedom of movement, because there will have to be movement between the minorities and people who are living on both sides, and the economic and security interdependence. And I think it will be two states in a confederated association, which is what I am both researching and supporting.
Thank you very much, Dahlia Scheindlin,
Thank
for
you.
coming to Dartmouth and talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting me.